So tonight we're going to continue part 3. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 4, kind of where we're going to continue where we left off next week. And really I think the theme tonight, it's been the ongoing theme, but we're really going to try and stretch the mind a little bit tonight in a good way and really kind of take these thesis statements that we've looked at, this concept that Genesis 1 through 11 is the biblical introduction to images and vocabulary, plot lines, and words. And so within this, we're going to look at more so themes tonight, and there will be some imagery as well. And then also going along with this thesis statement, our second thesis statement of how the biblical authors organized what they're saying is just as important as what they're saying. And so we're really going to look at the structure tonight of the passages or the chapters that we're looking at. And really what I want to focus on and kind of ask the question at the beginning, because it's something that we'll be visiting frequently throughout tonight, is the idea. I was listening to Tim Mackey this morning, and I've been taking a class of his online. He's the head of the Bible Project. He's a PhD in biblical studies, or biblical Hebrew, I think. But anyways, great resource. But he said something that was interesting. I think he's worded it the best I've heard it, because I've heard a lot of people mention this or say this concept, and it's the idea that when we look at the Bible and we tend to break it up into, should I interpret this literally or should I interpret this metaphorically? And what he was saying is that that's like doing surgery with an axe. It misses the mark entirely. We categorize it that way in our modern minds because that's how we operate, we think we work. But there's plenty of examples, and we'll see here shortly tonight, of how that's not how the original audience, or even in the time of Jesus, New Testament letters, that's not how it was perceived. And sorry, Cody, I think that was my fault. I bumped the screen, so I apologize. But thank you for all that you do too, Cody, by the way. So he's a miracle worker back there. I appreciate it. But we're going to do all this again with the goal of navigating the opening pages of the Bible, these first 11 chapters, in the same way as the original audience. We're going to do our best to get back into their minds. So this is where we'll be tonight. Again, we're going to finish the entire narrative of Genesis chapter 2 through Genesis chapter 3:21. We'll look at the quote-unquote the first fall, and also God's grace within that. And then we'll do the Cain and Abel story, and then also challenges and issues for modern thinking. We kind of just covered that briefly. But just to recap last week, this is really where we stretched last week a little bit in our thinking, looking at Genesis chapter 1 account of creation and the Genesis chapter 2 account of creation, how there's really two main macro views, and there's several little deviations within each view. But there's one view that would say they are two separate accounts of creation, with really that Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 being a transition, and that Genesis chapter 1 is a cosmic overview, God and his cosmic temple, or there's other forms of it. And that the second, and then Genesis chapter 2 focuses in on Eden specifically when God calls Adam and Eve. And the other view, which is this bottom view right here, is that Genesis chapter 2 is an elaboration of day 6. And we kind of talked about some of the issues perhaps within that view. And this, I didn't cover it too much last week, but this is just a good illustration and a good picture comparing Genesis chapter 1 account and the Genesis chapter 2 account. How we see the length of time varies in each account. In Genesis chapter 1, there's the 7-day narrative. Genesis chapter 2 account, it says in the day. The order of creation in the first account is man and woman are created at the same time. In chapter 2, man was created first, then other creatures, and woman last. The material, we talked about the waters in Genesis chapter 1. If you recall back to week 1, those are the primordial chaos waters referenced there. In Genesis chapter 2, it's more of a dry desert region that doesn't have enough water, and from that God essentially brings a garden forth. And then the method in Genesis 1, it's God's divine speech, and then in Genesis chapter 2, it's God actually forming, like the clay and the potter. And then the status, very good in the first, and then the tree of knowledge and the tree of good and bad, or good and evil, are present. And then humanity's place in Genesis chapter 1, they're kind of the apex of creation. They're the final, really active creation. And then within the Genesis chapter 2 account, they're just among the created order. So it's just kind of in the midst of everything else. And so we kind of, that's kind of a good overall view to kind of start that, or I guess recap from last week on how those two views I guess, issues maybe with this first view right here of it being an elaboration because there are some differences. But if we can look at it and perhaps it's a transition into God creates cosmically and then he focuses in on his own region, that Eden region, which we get to cover garden imagery tonight. So that's the big setup for this. But here's the full account. We stopped at this blue arrow last week. This is kind of that second narrative, if you will, of Genesis chapter 2. We have a stopping point at verse 25 in Genesis chapter 2. That's kind of where we break modern up, and because of chapter breaks. And again, we covered the chapter breaks a little bit last week, but this is really the overall macro structure of the entire Genesis 2 account. You can see it actually runs through chapter 3. And there are some ancient texts that'll have a stopping point at verse 21. Others will have it at verse 24 within chapter 3. And I'll talk about why here in a little bit. It actually has to do with God's grace. But either way, you can see that there's structure here, which will break down this structure and why it's relevant to the conversation and interpreting and how we interpret this, this account. So let's talk about gardens. And I love this picture because I think it's a beautiful picture. I stole it from Bible Project because they're an animation studio as well. But it's a picture of a garden coming out of the desert. And I think it's a great image of God planting that Eden, that paradise in the middle of a dry, barren wasteland. And so garden imagery, as you can see here, it was the language of heaven and earth in the time of the Bible. And specifically across all cultures. When you talked about gardens, every king had a garden. The gods had a garden kind of in every culture. And there's even, I've heard before, take this one with a grain of salt, but I have heard that the garden was actually always planted east of the palace. So when you think about Adam and Eve being kicked out, east of the Garden of Eden, they're being cast even further away from, kind of that main area. And then I've also heard that kings, when they would defeat a rival king, they would actually take trees from that king's garden and plant it in their own garden so that their garden would actually show all the kings that they had conquered. And so the gardens were very important to that time and that culture. And then God even talks about, when the Israelites go into exile and the prophets come to them, the prophets such as Jeremiah, he actually tells them, while you are in captivity, plant gardens. And so plant those pictures of paradise that you've lost to remember what you are hoping for one day. And we also, this again, for those of you that have been in Sunday school classes, I know you're thinking, wow, I can't believe this picture has been till week 3 to come up, but it's finally here. But this is a picture, really kind of the biblical picture of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is where this is heaven and this is earth, and the Garden of Eden is where heaven meets earth. And so that's kind of that paradise state is really that Edenic picture. And it doesn't just start in Genesis. Again, Genesis is the introduction to garden imagery, but you see gardens all the way throughout the story and ultimately in Revelation in the new heaven and new earth. I think what's cool about this, I think, Jeremy, you shared this past Sunday. You referenced this passage in some capacity in your message, and I had made this slide prior to this past Sunday, and so it was just really cool. It's happened every week. I'll be working on this and, praying into it, Lord, lead me where you want to go. And then Jeremy hits on a point that God has put on my heart as well. So this is not planned, at least by me and Jeremy, is what I'm trying to say. This is more, I feel, kind of God communicating to both of us. But this Revelation chapter 22, if you read all 5 of these verses, it's just Eden imagery, but in the state of perfection in the new heaven and the new earth when we are reunited. Eden is on the first page, and it's on the last page. It's what humanity lost, and it's what we will ultimately get one day. And really, when we look at Eden, and I love this picture right here. Eden is a reflection of the temple and tabernacle, or the tabernacle and the temple. If you see here in the middle, you've got the tree of life right here, the Garden of Eden. The garden of Eden is in a land called Eden, and then there's that dry land outside where God created the humans. And then he remember we talked about last week how he placed the humans, how they took up residence within Eden. So there's that dry land outside. And then in regards to the temple and the tabernacle, you have the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the courtroom, and then the land of Israel and Jerusalem. So it's this picture of the actual land, kind of something that Jeremy's preached on many times, is the spiritual, or the natural is a reflection of the spiritual in some capacity. And then In both of these instances, even further off beyond the dry land in the Genesis account, and then the dry land of Israel and Jerusalem is the furthest of the outer courts, where you will find our very own. No, you've taken enough shots at me that I figured it was finally time to get you back. So, and on your birthday too, how rude of me, but happy birthday. I finally managed to sneak one in on you. So I know that I've got more coming my way now, but okay, I appreciate that. But yeah, so let's get into actually Genesis chapter 3. We'll look at really this overview of the first account. We'll look at the structure of it, and this is where we get introduced to the serpent. And when we talk about the serpent, this is something that we spent some time with in the Sunday school, the Divine Counsel class, so I won't rehash all the material here, but the word for serpent is the Hebrew word nakash. And it has a triple meaning to it, just based on where it's used, the vowel markers, that kind of thing. But it can mean serpent. It can also mean copper. And it can also mean a diviner, someone that gives omens or divination. And so you can see that the numbers right here, just the breakdowns of how it's used throughout the Bible. But you can see in the garden, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here just to show you how the nakash can mean more than just serpent, but it's when the serpent specifically talks to Eve, he says, it says, but the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. And this is something that scholars have recognized as an omen. And so when you talk about, a diviner, someone that gives omens, that the serpent is actually essentially acting in that role as a diviner. And then what's really interesting is when you look at the punishment for the serpent in the story, is the punishment is on your belly you shall go, and snakes already crawl on their belly, so it's kind of a weird, well, aren't you already on your belly? Dust you shall eat, and snakes don't really eat dust, so that's something that probably shouldn't be taken literally. But this is more of language about being brought low to the ground. You're being brought low when you think of terms of, raised up, with God and then not with God, being brought low. And there's a correlation, again, to Isaiah. This word Hillel in Hebrew is this O-day star from Isaiah, which many have interpreted to actually be a reference to Satan or the divine rebel from Genesis chapter 1. And this is what it says: how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. And so a lot of people have drawn a correlation to this character here and the snake from the garden. And basically the long short of it is that rather than it being a snake in the garden or a serpent in the garden, that it was actually a divine being, a spiritual being that rebelled against God and came to Eve in the garden. And so that's one way it can be interpreted. Snakes are also, there's snake imagery all across the ancient Near Eastern cultures. So again, it's just another way to perhaps think about it and to stretch the mind as we read into these stories. But that is all we'll cover on kind of the divine nature side of it. I want to focus in on the structure of the story, and specifically how the snake interacts with both the man and the woman. And you can see here, this is evidence. This is where people are getting kind of the continuation narrative, how chapter 3 is not really a stopping point. You can see this 25 right here is chapter 2, verse 25. And we looked at this last week where it talked about the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So there's no shame in the nakedness. And then you have this narrative between the snake and the woman, and this yellow just represents the snake speaking, and the green is either the woman speaking to the serpent or the woman seeing that the tree was good. He took her advice, if you will. So there's this pattern of snake says, snake says, and then woman acts upon what the snake had said. She saw that the tree was good. And then you can see here the correlating to the blue up here is that all of a sudden they knew they were naked and then they hid themselves. So now where there was no shame before, where they were not ashamed of their nakedness, now they are ashamed that they are naked and hid themselves. And this is obviously a result of eating from that tree of good and evil or good and bad. And this really, why I'm focusing in on this aspect of it, is because this is that hinge point. When we look at the chiastic structure, and again, what chiastic structure means is simply you have a build-up to a climactic point in the story, and then the story reverses back on itself. And so you can see these patterns represent that, and basically the woman and the man taking and eating from the tree and then giving some, or the woman taking and eating and then giving some to her husband is that hinge point of this entire narrative. And so it's what's known as the test. And what's interesting about this being the test is we looked in week 1 about how we looked at how days 1 and 2, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6 are correlated. And we looked specifically within day 3 and 6 how there's a bonus act of creation. And that in day 3, it was specifically honing in on the fruit trees, how those are likened to human beings on day 6. So you have this humans and trees being made similar, or the author wanting you to think in similar terms when you see the word human and you see the word tree. And so we talked as well about different instances where humans are correlated to trees, where this correlation is made. Again, Adam and Eve, we're in that story right now at the fall. There's Moses at the burning bush. And then all of these examples, the vine and the branches in the New Testament. And then also Jesus, the cross is actually referenced as a tree as well, where Jesus was hung and where he was killed. But the entire point of this is that trees are often used to illustrate a moment of decision and testing for humans, along with that being correlated to them. And then people, just like trees, become places of testing, which we will see in the Genesis 4 narrative. But in terms of this tree being a place of testing, the tree is where Adam and Eve are confronted. And it's the tree of knowledge and good and bad. And then, again, there's this mysterious figure, whether it's a serpent, whether it's a divine being, convinces them that they're to eat this fruit. And this is what's interesting right here, and to what the serpent or this Nakash figure says to the woman is he says, "You will surely not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like gods, knowing good and bad." So again, this establishes the theme right here of trees becoming the places of testing because they are at this tree. And the reason I have the word gods underlined there is to kind of go back with the divine council class that we did in Sunday school, was that later on in the story when God says they will be like us, knowing, if they take from the tree of life. And so it's actually in verse 22 where Yahweh says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us." And so there's this belief. You'll see it translated in many Bibles as "you will be like God," but if that were the case, you have to ask the question of, are they really going to be the status of Yahweh or just one of his spiritual residents and divine family members? So anyways, something fun to think about. But just like you have, again, we talked about this chiastic structure, there is the man and the woman, they're created and they're unified, and then there's a dialogue between the snake and the woman, and I know that's hard to read, but that's what this section is right here. The reversal of those two in the chiastic structure is the dialogue between God and the humans, and then ultimately the consequences for all of the parties involved, namely the serpent, the woman, and the man. And what's interesting about that in terms of structure and how this text is written is that you actually have consequences handed out in this chapter in the order that the characters appear to quote-unquote rebel. So it's first given to the snake. The snake is given his punishment. The woman is then given her punishment, and then the man is given his punishment. So we'll start with the snake. In verse 15, it says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Now, most of us in here, I think, are very familiar with this being a reference to Jesus ultimately defeating what he did with the cross. Yes, and that's absolutely true. Prior to Jesus, the question has always been, how do you interpret this? And obviously, thank goodness we live in a time where we can interpret it as Jesus. But this is the point in the story, when we look at the Bible as a whole, that the author is telling you to pay attention to genealogies. We've all had those moments where we come across a chapter of entire genealogies, and you're like, why is this in here? Well, spoiler alert, Genesis 5 is all genealogy, and Genesis 10 is all genealogy. But there's a purpose for that. This is where, and the reason I have the word seed in here is because the word literally is seed. You'll see offspring in many translations, but it's literally a seed. So think a tree has a seed, humans having seed, that kind of thing. And so there's this correlation that they want you to pay attention to, that there is going to be essentially the woman's seed versus the seed of the divine rebel moving forward in the story. The woman is then next given her punishment, or not, I shouldn't say punishment, how about judgment? That's a better word for it. But this is what the Lord says to the woman. He says, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. What's interesting, and the reason I have this word pain highlighted, is because the word pain can also mean anxiety in Hebrew, which, given the ancient context, what really the ancient context behind that, I should say, is that a woman's barrenness was viewed in ancient times as something that was very detrimental to her status in society. So I'm not telling you that it should be translated as anxiety, I'm telling you it could be. So it could be pain or anxiety, but either way, this kind of poses a really interesting question, and it's something we'll cover a little bit later on, because we've heard kind of, at least there's in some views, that the world prior to Adam and Eve's sin at this tree was entirely perfect. If we've all heard there was no pain, there was no suffering prior to this, if this verse says, I will multiply your pain, that seems to indicate that there was some kind of pain or anxiety already present in the story. So again, we'll come back to that in a little bit, at least kind of the theme of that. But the man's judgment comes next, and it says, because you listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Again, that word pain is the same word of anxiety. But the reason I have that, I'll stop right here. I'm not trying to pick on the women here. I'm not trying to pick on the wives. The reason I have this underlined right here and I'm making a point about it is because this phrase shows up in the story of Abraham and Sarah. When it says, remember the story of Abraham and Sarah, is she can't have a child. That kind of goes back to she thinks that she was barren, kind of that status of society. So she says, hey, we got this slave in Egypt, sleep with her and your line can continue. We kind of know the story if she gets really jealous of Hagar, the slave at that point. But the phrase used, this phrase, because you listen to the voice of your wife, and is the same phrasing in the Abraham and Sarah story when they decide to do things their own way. Hagar becomes a tree of testing and they fail the test. So there's this repeat pattern in it. And then in verse 18, and on that too, this goes back to that term that we looked at, the word for helper, or when God says, I will make a helper, when it talked about making Eve or making woman out of the side, and how that word actually doesn't mean assistant or anything like that. It's the indispensable other, without whom the desired good cannot happen. And so because they are supposed to be a unit, if you will, that you can't have one without the other. If one functions bad, it causes the other to function bad as well and not walk out their purpose. And then going on to verse 18, it says, thorns and thistles, the ground, it shall bring for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. And so what's interesting about this, the ground becomes cursed. And ultimately the humans go from being in a lush garden paradise where food is plentiful and always available to now having to labor and toil and eat the plants of the field that they labor over, rather than the food of the garden that God had provided for them. And so you see this kind of, this is more than just, hey, you're going to have to start farming in this case. This is ultimately you're going to be banished from the presence of God. And so what's interesting here is transitioning on. It kind of goes right from this verse 19 right here, where it says, till you return from the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The very next line says, the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. It's kind of this, okay, you just went through this terrible list of consequences, and then, oh, by the way, her name was Eve. And it's kind of, that seems like almost an odd transition point, if you will. But what I'm getting at here is that you see this pattern, Eve and living, She's named Eve because she was the mother of the living. In Hebrew, it's a word play. Eve's name is the Hebrew word chava, and it literally means life or living. And so you see this name pattern. It's actually a continuation of the name pattern from Genesis chapter 1, but you see this naming pattern of someone being named that indicates, in this case, how Eve is correlated to living, how the words are correlated. You see that same naming and correlation pattern throughout the Bible. It actually starts in Genesis chapter 1 when God creates light, and he calls the light day. And then it continues on into the New Testament too, where in Matthew's gospel, it's talking about Mary. It says, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name, in Hebrew, Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins. Yeshua in their language meant the Lord is my salvation or salvation. And so you see this naming play continue all throughout the story. This is not something just unique to this 11 chapters. Again, this is an introduction on how names and people are introduced. And finally, in verse 21 says, and the Lord made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. So remember how they tried to cover themselves with the figs of the tree because they were ashamed of their nakedness. God actually provides a sacrifice out of animal skins for them. And then again, many have pointed to, and I think rightly so, that this is a correlation between a sacrifice being made for the sin of people. But along with this is where some texts, and I believe it's the oldest manuscripts really available, they actually have a break in the section right here. In other words, this is where the narrative of all of Genesis chapter 2 and 3 would end right here. Now, Genesis chapter 3 goes on 4 more verses, but I think, and it ends with the humans being banished, but I think what's interesting is that the text ending here is that this section break, and it was kind of meant to be, these are sections you read and then go back and digest from the way I understand it. This section, if it ends here, would actually end with an act of grace from God after the humans fall. So you have this fall, these consequences, and then you have God's atoning, covering grace for them. Now, again, with this, just correlating this to what we'll see in chapter 4, this naming pattern, when Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another seed. There's that word seed again, instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So Seth and appointed in Hebrew are actually related words. They sound very similar to one another. And also, here's the final 3 verses of chapter 3. This is when, again, the Lord says, behold, the man or the human has become like one of us. I say the human because that's that word ha-adam, where it's, a prefix added to, it really just means humanity. But behold, the human has become like one of us, knowing good and bad. That's why I'd reference it's possibly, you would be like gods. In other words, you would be like residents of the spiritual realm if you'd eaten the fruit. Now lest and it continues, now lest he reach out and take his hand and also take of the tree of life and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the human, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So this is where the humans are banished from God's paradise in the story. And you can see they go east. They travel east. That's going to be important. But they go to work the ground from which they were taken. So if we look back to chapter 2, when the man was originally created out of the dust, really out of the dust and water, the clay, the mud mixture, God took him out of a barren wasteland, essentially, placed him in this lush garden, and because the humans decided to do it their own way, instead of doing it God's way, they decided to try and acquire knowledge of good and bad their own way. That's actually, in biblical terms, that's how you would talk to a child. So it's implying that there's kind of this childlike nature to Adam and Eve, but they return to that original ground, that barren wasteland. And then again, east of the garden. And the reason that this is important is, and this is, what is his name? It's a scholar. His name is Michael Morales. He I don't know if he drew this picture, but this is a correlation that he's made, that when you look at Eden and when you look at the tabernacle and the temple, you essentially have a mirror image of one another. And if you actually follow this, there's the center of the garden, the tree of life, and you can see coming east here, there's the cherubim that guard the way, and then it branches off. There's the 4 rivers that we covered. It's the same pattern going from the Holy of Holies all the way out. And you can see this actually you move east out of the temple. So there's this narrative and there's this correlation they want you to draw that as you see the temple show up later in the story, it is a mirror image of Eden. And that's because the temple and the tabernacle were the place that God could come and dwell with his people. It's literally a temporary Eden, if you will. It's a traveling temporary Eden throughout the desert until they reach the promised land of Israel, where God establishes his temple, and then ultimately he's going to come back and reclaim the earth. So that's really what's going on here. And then one last thing before we jump into Genesis chapter 4. Again, this is the theme we looked at a little bit ago, but this one line in chapter 22 right here. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. This seems to imply that humans would not have lived forever because they had to eat from the tree of life to do so, and God is preventing that. And so this, I grew up at least hearing that, if Adam and Eve had never sinned, they'd still be alive, essentially in one way, shape, or form or the other. But this right here seems to imply that humans were not immortal leading up to this time. And so it doesn't really give us any more on that. I think this is really because we're asking questions that likely the ancient audience was not asking. But it's something interesting to think about. And so with that, we'll transition to chapter 4. And we know this is the Cain and Abel story. And what's so interesting is now that we've looked at the pattern of really Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, that one garden narrative, we're going to see a lot of similarities here in the Cain and Abel story. So here, because I can't get away from these pictures, this is the macro structure of Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4 is broken into 2 large sections. That's kind of this gray area right here. And they are, on both ends of it and in the middle are 3 birth scenes. So 3 scenes of children being born. And these 2 narratives, it's kind of they're depressing narratives because they both involve murder. And so there's the murder initially of Cain, and then there's one of Cain, or the murder of Abel, by Cain, and then there's one of Cain's descendants. And we'll kind of compare the similarities there. But going on, this is a scholar, Jordan Wenham. He noted this from chapter 4, that the term Abel and brother occurs 7 times, and the term Cain occurs 14 times. 14 just being, think instances of 7 that we looked at from Genesis chapter 1. There's that 7 theme coming back. And then the final verse of this chapter is at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This is the 70th mention of God or the deity in Genesis, and the 14th use of the key word call. So again, there's that 14 and 70 being, if 7 is complete, then 70 is kind of the idea is it's 10 times the completeness. But this is how he sums it up. He says, in all these respects, chapter 4 is entirely typical of the editorial techniques used throughout Genesis. Its present form must owe much to the final editor. Now, this has to get into, what he's kind of getting at here is authorship when it comes to the Bible, which is a fascinating topic. I absolutely love studying it. We're not going there tonight by any means, but I think it's interesting what he pointed out, that this theme of 7 continues throughout. But yeah, just interesting. I just wanted you mainly to see the macro overview. So I'm going to sum up really chapter 4, what happens, and then we'll look into some specifics of it right here. And here's the question. Here's the question that we can ask going into this. Where have I heard this story before? Now, we've only had 3 chapters up to this point, but as you'll see, it's this idea, this patterns throughout the Bible. So Cain's offering, you remember Cain and Abel both present an offering. Abel's is accepted, Cain's is rejected. And the Lord responds to him, if you do good, will you not be lifted up? This is a reflection of chapter 3, or chapters 2 and 3, I should say, where there's a choice about doing good at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then the Lord tells Cain, sin is crouching at the door. So there's the temptation. And it matches the human temptation that Eve faced at that tree as well, to take and eat of the fruit. Cain murders Abel. He fails the test. And in that sense, Abel has become like a tree, a place of testing for his brother. So where Adam and Eve fell at the tree, at the literal tree in the garden, Cain now fails his test at Abel, but remember, humans and trees are likened together. So God shows up and asks a question. He says, where is your brother? Just like God appeared and asked the question to Adam and Eve, he said, where are you? And that's where they came out and they said, hey, we were hiding because we were naked, and we were ashamed of that nakedness. And so you see this repeat of God showing up and asking a question. In both instances, they dodge the question. Cain responds with the famous line, am I my brother's keeper? Whereas both Adam and Eve responds by saying, the serpent tempted me, or the serpent told me in some way, shape, or form, and I did. And then Adam turns around and said, the woman you gave me made me do it. And so in all three instances, the human dodges the question. Going on in the Genesis chapter 4 narrative, a curse is placed on the ground because of what Cain did to his brother. It says, and now you are cursed from the ground. And in this story, the ground almost becomes like a character because it says the blood of your brother, or it's either the blood or the ground is crying up on behalf of your brother. And then just like in Genesis chapter 2 or chapter 3, in that narrative, there is a curse placed on the ground. There's a curse placed on the ground. And then this one is a little bit, this goes back to verse 7 right here. I know we've kind of been going up. We've been in verse 11 up to the last point, but I'm following the pattern of Genesis, the Genesis chapter 2 and 3 account. But this is what it says in verse 7 of chapter 4. It says, sin's desire is toward you, but you should rule over it. This is inverted from when God tells Eve, your desire shall be toward your husband, but he shall rule over you. It's the same Hebrew words used in both instances. So it's flipped, if you will. And then going on in the Cain and Abel story, the Lord tells Cain, he says, when you till the ground, no longer shall it yield its strength to you. And yes, there's a typo in there by me. My apologies. But and in the Adam and Eve story, working the ground became more difficult as well. Then ultimately Cain is banished, which, interesting fact, he is banished to the east as well. But just like Adam and Eve were banished to the east of the garden. And so you see really this repeating theme where Cain's parents fail the test at the tree, and in the same, essentially 10 steps, Cain fails the exact same test again. And the result, the consequences are a little bit more. It's more than just you failed and you got banished. Again, like we saw with Adam and Eve, the punishment is Cain murders his brother, and he says to the Lord, my punishment is too harsh to bear, and the Lord essentially promises you'll be the person who harms you will be avenged 7 times. But Cain's son goes on to build a city, and it's a civilization, and it's the first city that's mentioned in the Bible. And cities don't do too well at the beginning of the Bible. They're kind of this place of disorder and, where great evil stirs up. And then ultimately, and this is just so you can see the reversal kind of theme of this mini chiastic structure, is that Cain has a descendant, I believe it's his grandson, named Lamech. And Lamech's son, whose name is Tubal-Cain, has a civilization that invents weapons. And Lamech also is the second murder story in this as well. So you can kind of see that the result of Cain's action, murdering his brother, just is a snowball effect for bad things happening down or throughout the rest of the narrative. And then also what was interesting, I can't remember the scholar, I don't have his name that wrote this, but he said, he made reference to city building in the ancient Near East where this came from. City building was a divine enterprise. And so where it was viewed as a divine enterprise, now in this story you have humans trying to step into that role. But I thought that was an interesting correlation. Now, where the stories are a little bit different when we look at this narrative of Genesis 4, where Cain murders and then also his descendant Lamech murders, Cain is actually sorrowful when it comes to his murder. He says, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. We'll get into a little bit more on what he says next, but first I want to look at, just so that you can see the narrative structure of these two stories of murder happening, where Cain is sorrowful, his descendant Lamech is not. And this is what it says. Lamech said to his wives, this is in chapter 20, or verse 23. Lamech says to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. And so, whereas God is the one who essentially gives, I don't want to say blessing, but God is the one who tells Cain that you will be avenged 7 times. It's God telling Cain that. In this narrative, Lamech takes it upon himself to basically say, if my ancestor got 7, was avenged 7 times, then I get 77 times that. So it's now a human trying to give himself his own blessing. And I just broke this down into colors so that you can see this is actually a poem. Not a great poem when you read the words of it. By any means, it's a boastful poem about murder. But so that you can see kind of the literary style. And when you come to passages, when you're reading the Bible, you'll see this style occur quite frequently where it says, here it has his 2 wives' name, then he gives a proclamation, then the wives are listed, and then listen to what I say. So it's just trying to go over the narrative pattern at the same time I cover the story as well. But what's interesting about Lamech as well is that this is the instance where we see the perversion of the marriage institution. Lamech is the first person in the Bible to have 2 wives. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 1, that man and woman coming together, that was the perfect union, husband and wife. Lamech now has 2 wives. And then with these wives, Lamech has 3 sons. And each one of these sons, and I don't have the names up here, but each one of the 3 sons, they're titled the father of a cultural institution. And so the interest of the narrative is in the origins of human civilization and its diverse institutions. Again, we looked at kind of his descendants being the ones that kind of came up with this idea of weaponry. But that's kind of what's going on at play here as well. And this actually, we talked about polemic a little bit last week. This would be considered polemic as well, because this account would have stood in contrast to Israel's surrounding neighbors and their accounts for the origins of animal husbandry, music, and metalworking. And those are the 3 institutions of Cain, or of Lamech's sons right there. And those institutions, if you will, were all viewed as divine wisdom from the gods. And so whereas the gods and other stories had to give that knowledge to people, the biblical story is simply saying that these came from a man, where ultimately God is Yahweh is the only one who can actually give out. And so it is a little bit of an aggressive eye poke, if you will, a polemic narrative against the surrounding cultures. But again, just to kind of recap here, this grand narrative is that at the beginning of this chapter 4, a child is named in relation to Yahweh. And then you have the murder narrative. Then a city is named in relation to humans, and that's the name of, going through Cain's line right there. And then Lamech, one of Cain's descendants, murders. But at the very end, you have something very interesting right here. It ends with the naming of another child in relation to God that results in true worship. So just how we looked at that act of grace from Genesis chapter 3, there's something else at play here too. And it's essentially because Abel was murdered. This is what verse 25 and verse 26 say. These are the final verses of the chapter. It says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another seed instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." So again, Seth and appointed are both correlating Hebrew words. They sound very similar to one another. And there's that seed talk going back to seed. Pay attention to the upcoming generations that you will see, because these generations are ultimately the story of God's people and where they come from. And then verse 26 says, "To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh." And then it ends with this phrase, "At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord." So where Abel is murdered and Cain essentially starts this horrible downfall because of him, of civilization turning and evil happening and more murder happening, a replacement is given for Abel, who was murdered, and it is ultimately Seth who what the story is telling you here is that is the line where people began to call on the name of the Lord again. So you have this great redemptive act in the story again. But it's an invitation, because next week in chapter 5, we're going to look at the genealogy list, and that genealogy list in contrast to, kind of the genealogy list that will come from Adam, or from Seth, from Adam all the way down through Seth and his descendants, as opposed to other generations or other seeds that are opposed to God. And so a little preview for next week as well. But I want to focus on two concepts really, just to stretch us a little bit more tonight, because we've looked at some concepts that may have, that where the traditional view may have a little bit of issues. But I want to focus in on something because I don't want to ignore this, because it's a question that's been asked by a couple people, and both just I believe it was in our previous session that we had last week before. But going back to Cain's sorrow, this is what Cain says. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden." Verse 15 says this. I skipped a little section for a reason. Verse 15 is just when the Lord says to him, this is when the Lord promises, "No, if anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him." Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So this stems all the way back. I'm going to bring us back to the very beginning of week 1. We looked at these two ways that Genesis can be interpreted, or Genesis 1 through 3. We had the traditional view and the Hebrew syntax view. And really, what I'm getting at here, and I understand that there's varying views. This is not, you can have these two kind of main views, and there's views on how to view the text. That question we asked at the beginning, should it be literal? Should it be metaphorical? And that I like what Tim Mackey said, is that's not enough. And so what can often stem from this traditional view, I really want to illustrate, going back to here, how that can be a starting point for the baseline of an entire theological system. And they both can, but we're going to specifically look in at the traditional view tonight. And so this is verse 14 right here, the part that I left out. Cain says this, "I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And the issue with the traditional view, and specifically the traditional view, there's many views on how we should interpret Adam and Eve. Were they the first ancestors? Were they just types and symbols? Are they a combination somehow of them all, or of parts of all of them, I should say? But the only characters we've been introduced to in the biblical narrative so far are Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. So the question is, who is Cain talking about? Because Cain killed his brother, and there's no one else aside from his parents, and he's being cast away from his parents. So why is he afraid that other people out there will kill him? And this is kind of what we're looking at, is the issue of Adam and Eve really being the first humans. Were they the first humans ever created? Kind of that in the beginning. Was that the first absolute beginning moment, and were Adam and Eve the first people? Because verse 17 goes on and says, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And so and again, I kind of grew up hearing the traditional view of this. It begs the question, who's Cain's wife? We don't know of anybody else in the story. But what I always heard growing up was, well, Adam and Eve would have had a lot of time to have kids. People lived a lot longer back then, all of those kind of views. So Cain probably just went and married one of his sisters and then went and started a civilization. Okay, I get that, but it does present views, and people have long recognized that doesn't line up very well with verses like this in Leviticus 18, where it says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister." And so there's this idea, this institution that God puts in place, and this is God later says of all these detestable sexual practices that they are not to do these. One, because you're not to make yourself unclean, and because you're not to practice any of the abominable customs of the nations around you that are not walking with one true God. And the response to this, I understand, is Leviticus is much later in the story than Genesis chapter 3. And 100% I agree, but so is murder. Murder doesn't show up until the Ten Commandments either. And so Cain's banishment was a consequence of his sinful act of murdering. And then we also have to ask the question this, even though these passages occur later in the text, one right here, murder doesn't show up till later, so would that have been wrong at that time? We do have verses like this from, a believing, Christian standpoint of John 1:1. And we all know it well, as in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. It's a reference to Jesus, obviously, being the Word. And the reason I have the highlighted right there is just like we looked at in the Hebrew syntax view in week 1, the definite article the is not there in the Greek text either. It's just in beginning. And that's true for the New Testament and the Greek Old Testament as well. It's absent in it. So just something fun to keep in mind. But to go on a little further, to chase this a little further down the rabbit hole, we have these 3 verses right here where it says Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Then he says, I and the Father are one in John chapter 10, verse 30. And then Numbers 23:19 says, God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. So there's this idea that if God would have given something at that specific time, whether you look at the Leviticus passage we looked at or the Exodus passage we looked at, Jesus was in there with him at the beginning. His word has always been there. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I think the issue that arises from that is where people have found it hard to, I think, deal with that traditional view of were Adam and Eve the first biological human beings ever in existence is the idea that was incest the only possible way for humans to be fruitful and multiply. Kind of that two sides to that coin. Be fruitful, multiply from the royal priest, Adam and Eve being a royal priest standpoint, yes, but also procreating and filling the earth and multiplying it. Would God have made that the only option? And so I think that's a question, again, that we need to take seriously within this conversation. But I think we also, maybe more serious than that, is we need to ask ourselves, how was the ancient original audience taking this text? How are they receiving this message? Were they asking those same questions? Were they asking the questions about origins and biological human beings? And, are we to take it literal or metaphorically? Again, I agree with Tim Mackey on that point that I think it misses it. I think the Bible is trying to communicate a much richer story, and we've done some imposing, whether we know it or not, and myself guilty on that as well. And I think one of the goals really of navigating this text in the way that the ancients did is trying to strip away my modern mindset from my personal self, but also see where we can strip that away to where we can get the fullness of the text. And this brings on to one other issue too, because this kind of idea of pre-Adamic races, if you will, or pre-Adamic human beings, I should say. There's another concept that goes hand in hand with this and that Hebrew syntax view versus traditional view, and it boils back to a person or a man known as Augustine of Hippo, which is an interesting name. But he was a North African bishop in the 4th century. He was a philosopher and a theologian. And I got this quote from a website that does a lot of apologetics. They said this about him, and it's not, he's really praised in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox circles, but specifically this was not a Catholic or East Orthodox website. It was very much just Protestant, from a Protestant viewpoint. But this is what they said. They said, for both Protestants and Catholics, it is impossible to measure Augustine's effect on church history. So he's had a major impact on church history. And one of the areas that he has influenced, arguably the area he's influenced the most, is on this passage of Romans 5:12 right here. And there's nearly 2,000 years of debate behind this. So again, this is just ways to think about this. This is not me saying I found the answer. I certainly have not. So this is just ways that we can look at it. But this is Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Now, what's interesting about Augustine in this verse is that Augustine used, and this is information I gathered from scholars. I talked to one of my good friends as well about this issue, and not just any good friend. He was a Greek Bible major in college. That was his degree, and he actually reached out to his Greek professor because I kept bugging him so much about this. I was like, can you put, he was actually reading ancient text on the internet and sending me pictures, like circling words and all this. So I say that just to let you know that I'm not coming in here just like, this is not something I just saw on some random website. This is scholarly material that I've gathered, as well as going to people that I trust because of their background and their profession. But Augustine was a Latinist, and so he worked within the Latin text. So he didn't like Greek or Hebrew very much at all. I think it was actually said that he hated Greek, and he used a Latin translation. And the Latin translations came from the Greek translation. That's something to keep in mind here. And something I heard one scholar say, who was referencing other scholarly material that he had read, he just didn't give the name of the articles, and I don't know if they were publicly accessible anyways, but it was said that there's a thought that the Latin translation that Augustine used came from a defective Greek text. And essentially what the issue is that we looked at that Romans 5:12 right here, death spread to all men because all sinned. So that would kind of imply, we are sinners because we sin, if you will. The translation that Augustine gives is that death passed unto all men in whom all have sinned. So his take on it was that that in whom is a reference to Adam. And Augustine's thought was he took this verse to imply that all human beings who descend from Adam are held accountable for Adam's sin, and so inherit biologically from Adam both original sin and original guilt. In other words, we are born from the time of conception, if you will, in our modern thinking. We are sinners from the time of conception, and we bear the consequences of Adam's sin from long ago. And there's a lot of issues that arise from that reading of it, and we don't have time to get into all of them tonight. But again, it's this idea of, was it a bad translation or not? I think we really need to ask the questions, are we guilty? Are we born into sin? Or is sin something, are we sinners because we ourselves sin? Because the real implication here, the big one here, and there's a lot of side kind of issues with this that are also important. The main issue that arises from this interpretation from Augustine, and this has been the interpretation that the West has taken, so kind of, Western, Roman Catholicism all the way down to Protestantism, and today, Eastern Orthodox doesn't accept this view at all. And they're saying, we don't accept it because we were using the original Greek text, and he was not. But all that I'm getting at is that how does this apply to Jesus? Because Jesus is described as fully man, fully human. So if all men are sinners by birth, why does Jesus get off the hook? And that's just a rhetorical question. I'm not looking for answers out loud. It's something I'm asking myself too when I look at this view. Because if Jesus was a sinner by birth, and if he was guilty by birth, he could not have been the perfect sacrifice. And it also goes into this view and this idea kind of along with this view, kind of, I'm hoping that you're seeing the pattern kind of arise from how that traditional view, which again, I'm not saying the traditional view is bad, but how it can lead to a theological system built up to where ultimately we get problems such as, was Jesus a sinner? But there's also Romans 5:12 is heavily used, and I'm certainly not trying to pick on individuals or these groups or ministries, but it's used by these individuals, groups, and by certain individual groups and ministries, certain. Not broadly speaking of everyone, but who have adopted the first ancestor view, or that more modern and literal view that Adam and Eve were the first people ever, the start of humanity, and they use it as a proof text for a perfect world. So no death of any kind, whether it be humans, plants, animals, etc., which the text is really talking about in Romans people anyways. There's no reference to animals or plant life. But another question we have to ask ourselves, is that what the text says? And I mean it literally, because in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, at the end of everything, the seventh time the word good is used, it says, behold, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. There's a Hebrew word for perfect, and it's not used there. it means very good. And then I just put Psalm 19:7 in here because it does have the word perfect in there, which is more of a word of completeness. But what I'm kind of getting at there is asking the question is, was the world, and again, I'm not providing the answer for it, something to think about. God, perfect God. I think we can all agree that he's a perfect God, all-powerful creator. Was his creation described as very good, or was it described as perfect, or does very good mean perfect? Because I think when we look at that question, what we end up finding as the story goes on is that if the world was perfect, why did Adam and Eve have to take dominion over the fish and over the birds? If it was perfect, why did God place him in the garden so that he could work it and serve? If it was perfect, really, would any work be required of it? And that it's just, again, it's a rhetorical question, not providing the answer for it, but it's things to think about when we come into the background of, everything was created perfect, and we look at instances in the story, well, if it was perfect, would this have been necessary? And then kind of going along with this, and this is really where we're wrapping up tonight, is slide from the first week, but kind of taking that ancient thought and our modern thought and trying to really dive into the idea of the Bible not being written to us, but being written for us. And again, I showed this picture week 1 too, which is the merging of these two pictures right here, which it does create a biblical or a nice picture. And in terms of biblical theology, it creates a pretty theology, if we can use that as an illustration. But here's the question I want to end on tonight. Are we allowing the biblical text and the biblical authors to answer the intended questions and communicate the intended messages and meanings through the process of inspiration that God wanted to communicate to audiences of all times, starting with a group of people dating back thousands of years ago? Or are we attempting to find answers to the questions that we as moderns ask and care about? In other words, origins, historical literary accounts, literature styles, that kind of thing. And thus impose, whether it's incidentally or we do it intentionally, what we know as reality and what we perceive as our worldview into the ancient text, written to a group of ancient people living in a different culture and with a different worldview. And so I'm hoping that partially, again, the goal of this is to get back to this picture here in terms of the Bible, is to think like an ancient person. How would they have thought about it to truly strip? And I'm on this journey with you, something I said in week 1, but trying to strip away the questions that I ask, the questions that I want answered today. We all come in, we all have questions as modern people that we want answered. And I think sometimes I certainly fall into, I want the Bible so bad to answer it, I need to be careful that I'm not imposing a worldview, my worldview, and the question that I want answered on a specific passage. And it goes beyond Genesis 1 through 11. It's applied to all of it. And I think I'm going to end here with Paul as well, because I think Paul gives us a hint of maybe how we should be considering these passages as they come up, and really throughout the whole Bible. And I think it's a scripture that we all know fairly well. In 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, it says, all scripture, which all scripture for Paul at that time would have been the Old Testament. But it says all scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. And the key phrase here is that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. And so when I see this, it doesn't say equipped to answer every question that I have. It means for every good work going forward. So again, that's where I'll end tonight. Next week, we'll pick up with chapter 5, chapter of genealogies, which I'm really excited about, and we will get into the flood narrative as well. So I hope it's been a good night for you all. Thank you everyone online for watching. Thanks for letting me go a little bit over, everyone that was here and online.